First of all, I think that we all agree that climate change is not an environmental problem. It's not only an environmental problem because it is true that it's currently defining a new geopolitical order and putting under scrutiny the current economic and development model. And why? Because to combat climate change we need a deep technological reconversion, we need a change in our energy matrices, we need a reduction of consumption among the wealthy, and this is a big issue. And from our perspective there is also a challenge on equity and the combat against poverty. And perhaps that's what explains the difficulties when we are negotiating a new climate change regime. I mean, this is not about the environment, it is about our current economic and development models. And also, I think that here it's a microcosm of the current power structure around the world. And unfortunately, I don't think that this is good timing to reach an international global commitment on climate change. The current financial crisis, I think, has created desperation among the most powerful economies on the ways on how to continue growing and not losing competitiveness. And I think it's desperation what we see. What we have heard, I was a couple of weeks ago at the Major Economies Forum in Washington, is how do we resolve these inconveniences such as climate change to continue growing regardless of the quality of the growth, regardless of the costs of growth, and at the expense of the most poor and vulnerable. To this global context, we have that the disaster of Fukushima, the Fukushima disaster eroded confidence on nuclear energy and has forced some countries to turn their gaze back to gas and coal. I mean, we see the example of Germany, for example, and we all know that, that gas and coal are great sources of CO2 emissions. And I think that we need to take this on consideration. Here in 2010, it was the first year after a decade that the G20 countries did not reduce emissions, in spite of the crisis. I mean, their economies grew at the same pace as their emissions, in more than 5%. And paradoxically, 5 is a key figure here for us because the Kyoto Protocol signatories agreed to reduce their emissions by 5% in between 2008 and 2012. I think that we all know that even the Kyoto Protocol signatories have not complied with their reduction commitment, and that's perhaps one of our main problems, and my colleagues have already mentioned that. More than 24% of the emissions belong to one country that is not signatory of the protocol. What is of high concern of Ecuador is also the countries that are signatories that had expressed that they won't go for a second commitment period, especially, well, we all know Japan, Canada, and Russia. Apparently, sustainable development, shared responsibility for global public goods, for us the atmosphere is the global public goods, human security have been forgotten in these discussions and have been overshadowed by the immediate and insatiable greed of the powerful. And I say this with complete honesty. So, what are the expectations of countries like Ecuador for this COP? And for us, it is not only about insisting on a bottom-up approach. It's about respecting the legitimacy of the multilateral system and international law. This is what is under scrutiny here. We signed a legal agreement, a multilateral legal agreement, and it doesn't suit my national interest, so I just give up and say, we don't like this anymore, so we want to come with something else, this new legally binding agreement, which, by the way, we're not against a more comprehensive framework, but after we have complied with our previous commitments, such as the Kyoto Protocol. So our flag as Ecuador, as ALBA countries, is to fight in the defense of the Kyoto Protocol and the second commitment period. Regarding Canada, Japan, and Russia, I think that the public opinion, the outside world, they have to say something about that. It's not our responsibility, but what are we going to do with these three countries? But on the other hand, Ecuador has been, very strong in saying that multilateral rules are about the will of the ample majority. It is not about unanimity. We cannot please everybody. So we have to go forward with the second commitment period, even if not all the signatories to the protocol agree with it. The second issue is to maintain the legitimacy and integrity of the convention. Because we have heard, and I had a feedback from my delegation today, that very basic issues and principles of the convention are being forgotten or put out of the new texts. The convention, it is very important that we remember that establishes principles that are key for developing countries, such as the historical responsibility of Annex I countries on climate change, and the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. A pity that we harm the Kyoto Protocol and the integrity of the convention here in this very African continent. The other issue is that, looking at what will happen in 2012, we have the Rio +20 process coming in Brazil in 2012. We cannot arrive to Rio with one less convention or one less multilateral instrument, which is the Kyoto Protocol. That would be an embarrassment. The third issue is the Green Climate Fund. Let me address very briefly four of the issues. Is the legal status of the fund. We need to have a legal form for the fund that would be under the authority of the COP, and only under the authority of the COP. The governance of the fund for us is extremely important. We have concerns about who is going to be in charge of the administration of the fund. For us, for countries like Ecuador, the World Bank poses a series of concerns and problems because of its own governance as a multilateral bank. We have all suffered in the South, we have all suffered from the multilateral. The other issue is the source of the funding. Some of the countries are saying that since the world lives in a deep financial crisis, basically we need to rely on private finance to feed the Green Fund. For us, that is unacceptable. We are speaking about public, predictable, and additional funding for climate change, which doesn't mean that private financing is not welcome. Of course, it is welcome, but in addition to public funding commitments. We're also concerned that the private funding are going to come directly through a special window, private funding to private actors at the national level. There is a need to go through our national climate change authorities and respond to national public policy on climate change at the national level. This is very important. The Ecuadorian constitution is the first, as we know, around the world that recognizes nature as a subject of rights. So in order to respect the rights to nature, I mean, we need to put forward all these actions that would enable economies and countries like Ecuador to go through what we call a post-oil era, a post-oil development model. But this, of course, cannot happen if we don't have the proper international, multilateral ambience to enable countries like ours to do the efforts that we are already doing to combat climate change. For us, the combat to climate change is also the combat to poverty and inequality. These, in our opinion, go together. So.